Thank you very much. Was it Nick? I'm sorry. Nate, your comments are prescient. We are going to hear a little bit about affirmative action bake sales today, as a matter of fact. Thank you so much for having me today. It was an arduous journey from San Diego, but very much worth it. I now know what humidity feels like again. I've been told that this does not constitute humidity, but very happy to be here, very honored to be here. Thank you to everybody. Now, for more than half a century, we'll go like this. For more than half a century, conservative critics housed in think tanks, foundations, and the media have championed the cause of conservative college students who they say suffer on college campuses. In books with such titles as Free Fall of the American University, Tenured Radicals, and Indoctrination U, critics charge that American higher education has become the playpen of liberal, if not actually radical faculty, and that in the classrooms of the politicized university, middle-of-the-road students complacently consume their professors' misinformation. Liberal students, meanwhile, smugly revel in the feeling that they're on the right side of the political divide, and conservative students are forced to decide whether to endure their professors' tirades quietly or voice their outrage, thereby running the risk of sacrificing their grades. Now, to mitigate the leftist campus, well-funded conservative organizations have been put in place. David Horowitz, for instance, has introduced the Academic Bill of Rights in a variety of state legislatures to legally protect students from the imposition of liberal orthodoxy, while others like the Young Americas Foundation sponsor conferences that introduce thousands of students each year to the celebrities of the right. The Clare Boothe Luce Policy Institute is specifically targeted to conservative women, while more intellectually styled organizations like the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, first headed by William F. Buckley, and the Federalist Society, which is home for elite conservative law students, provide internships and seminars for budding journalists, conservative academics, and jurists. Now, how many of you have heard of any of these organizations? Clare Boothe Luce Policy Institute? Okay, so a handful. And then, of course, there's also the internet, which is a place for conservative students of all stripes to blog, network, and build a name for themselves, often with funding from larger organizations and foundations, with folks attached whose names are quite familiar, the Koch brothers, John Olin, Sarah Scaife, and so on. Yet while this movement to build a core of young, ideologically dependable lawyers, journalists, congressional staff, and voters has been a central priority of the right, few have studied the effort to mobilize these students or to examine just how their experience squares with the conservative critiques out there. So this has left us in the odd situation of not knowing if the accusations leveled against universities actually resonate with the students on whose behalf they're made. Nor do we know much of anything else about conservative students, such as when and why they become conservative, what their political turning points are. The question of what do conservative students want to do when they graduate? What are their career aspirations, both in and outside of politics, and how do these differ, say, from other students? We don't have much of a clue at all about who conservative students know in the larger world of conservative thought and politics, what those social networks are. And finally, we've been left more or less in the dark, except for a few reports in the media, about how students on the right enact their conservatism on campus, what kinds of speech and action they use to get their points across in public on campus. We don't know if conservative students share the same political styles from one university to the next, and what that would look like if they did, or whether different campus groups diverge from one another. Now, since these are the kinds of questions that haven't been asked, they are naturally the kinds of questions that I and my co-author, Kate Wood, who's a doctoral student at UC San Diego with me, these are the questions that we gravitated toward while writing our book, which is a comparative case study of two universities. We primarily use qualitative data collection to study these two universities, one of which is a private elite Ivy League university, which we call Eastern Elite University. We were asked not to use its name. Maybe we can do a guessing game at the end, see if you can tell which universities these are. The other university in our comparative case study is a Western public university, which incidentally is not my home institution. And in this talk, I'll focus mostly on the last set of issues that I raised above, which is the styles of conservatism that we saw at these two different universities, which are markedly divergent from one another. Now, before I get started telling you about our findings, I want to say just a few words about how I selected these two schools for the study in the first place and how I conducted interviews at them and other kinds of data collection methods. So first, I selected these two schools along dimensions of both similarity and difference. And this is a classic case study methodology, which is designed to yield insights that one couldn't get from a single case study. And in terms of similarities, both of these universities are secular. They're not attached to a religious orientation, and they're both Research 1 institutions, which mean that research and teaching take place at them. PhDs are conferred on graduate students and so forth. So they're similar in that regard. They're also similar in terms of being in the conservative spotlight as liberal bastions. So for example, if you turn on Sean Hannity's show, you might hear both of these universities pointed to as places where conservative students suffer quite a bit. Now, in terms of the differences between these two universities, obviously one is private, the other is public. The private institution has higher selectivity in admissions. It's harder to get in. The size is different. Eastern Elite is smaller. It's got about 8,000 undergraduates compared to 22,000 undergraduates at Western Public. And the student to faculty ratio is quite different at these two institutions. So a much lower student to faculty ratio at Eastern Elite Private. So students presumably know their faculty, their professors a little better. In addition, they're different in terms of their reputations. So Eastern Elite is known as one of the most prestigious institutions in the nation. Western Public is known as a very good university. However, it's also known to be a party school, so recreation is at a premium at Western Public. Now, to collect data at these two, I used what's known as a chain referral method, beginning with clubs and other groups that posted on the internet. Now, what I did when I was looking for these groups in 2007 was to go online and look at a variety of campus clubs and try to get as many students and alumni from each of those clubs as I possibly could until I ran out of people who were willing to talk with me. So I talked with members of college Republicans, I talked with members of pro-life groups, gun groups on campus, writers for conservative newspapers, conservative writers for the main campus newspaper. So these were mostly active conservatives on campus. But through my chain referral sample, I would ask these active students if they had names of people who were a little bit more behind the scenes, maybe who weren't as active in conservative politics on campus. So I did capture those, some of those folks as well. Now, demographically, these students and alums were predominantly white. This maps on to national data about conservatives. There were more men than women in my sample. And they were generally pretty religious. At the very least, almost everybody said that they were at least spiritual, if not religious. But there's a range of religiosity, but most people argued that said that they were religious. Now, in terms of socioeconomic class, and this is important because the styles that I'm going to be talking about today may seem as though they would align more with a kind of upper class demeanor versus a lower class. And so I want to get class figured out here. There was some significant social class variation between our two cases. At Eastern Elite, students tended to come from families that were more affluent and whose parents had higher education levels. than students at Western Public. And this is not a surprise. Research tells us that students who go to elite selective universities do come from more affluent families. However, what's important to point out here is that there was a lot of what we call variance in the samples on both campuses. So there were students who came from families whose parents had only gone to high school, all the way up to have received advanced degrees. So we had a lot of spread on each campus. So it cannot be said that all of the students at Eastern Elite came from much more affluent or cultured families than those at Western Public. So why do we go into so much detail telling you about our sample? Well, given these basic demographic similarities across these two campuses in terms of race, gender, class, and religion, if we find that the styles of conservatism that students enacted were radically different from one another at Eastern Elite and Western Public, then we'd have a strong case, which we do, for arguing that universities are enormously important in shaping young people's politics. The reason I emphasize this is that common wisdom holds that however a student might happen to be has a lot to do with that student's individual choices, just what his or her individual preferences are. And what we're arguing in this book is that these individual preferences get shaped very, very much by the particular college environment that students go to. So the college you go to, even if you start out conservative, is going to play a very large role in how you're going to be conservative. And this is important, I think, because it makes us perhaps think a little differently about politics in the US and think about some of the origins of the differences that we see in our body politic. Okay, so with all of that in our heads, I want to turn now to the styles of conservatism that we actually did see on these campuses. And to do so, I'm going to open with a couple of vignettes from our data, beginning with Western Flagship, and Nate's earlier comments will resonate with you. So, it's 2007, and members of the college Republicans at the Western Flagship campus have just staged an event called the Affirmative Action Bake Sale. The bake sale is a well-known piece of political theater that conservative students put on at many universities across the country, selling cookies at a higher price to white students than they do to, say, African Americans or Latinos. The bake sale is said to highlight the insidious effects of race-based affirmative action on whites, but when students at Western talk about what it's actually like to stage the event, it's clear that they revel in the sheer fun and confrontation that their activity stirs up. So on the one hand, they say that they're making a point. On the other hand, they love doing this because it creates a lot of controversy. So one interviewee said, so we're out there and it's like 5 college Republicans, and for about half an hour, community members would come by and say, oh, I'm a white guy and I've got to pay $1. People are really getting into it. Of course, meanwhile, there's a noontime rally organized by the diversity thugs, and what he means by the diversity thugs are those groups of, say, college Democrats, people who are arguing against what he's doing. They've got their bullhorns out, they're angry, they've got their signs, and I've got no problem with protesters. I want the protesters there. This kind of event is one of a fairly large number of provocative actions that conservative students put on at college campuses alongside Catch an Illegal Alien Day, in which one student will be marked as an undocumented alien, and other people will chase that alien down. Another event is the Global Warming Beach Party, in which climate change is made fun of with suntan oil and beer, and the Conservative Coming Out Day, which you can easily imagine is a take or a twist on LGBT coming out days, basically saying, hey, we're conservative, we're here, get used to it, right? And such events are promoted by national conservative organizations like the Young America's Foundation, which spends many millions of dollars a year helping conservative students learn to be activists in what we're calling the provocative style. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away at Eastern Elite, such an event is considered verboten. not so much by administrators and faculty, although they're not crazy about these kinds of things, but by conservative students themselves. At this private university, most conservative undergraduates denounce the act of pushing liberals' buttons just for the sake of it. One conservative student at Eastern said, look, I don't think something like that is helpful. What person walks up to a table to buy a cupcake and realizes that this is an affirmative action bake sale and then walks away thinking, wow, that was a great illustration of the problems with affirmative action? The only thing that I've ever seen come from putting on events like that is divisiveness and lack of communication. Others at Eastern whom we interviewed concurred, saying such an event would be unsuitable for the sensibility of their campus, even though they had heard of such things. Instead of provoking, they prefer to use what we call civilized discourse. Now, these two styles of conservatism are pretty much mutually exclusive. The provocative style, as I've just described it, almost never ever gets used at Eastern, and when it does, student groups learn not to use it again. One interviewee who is in the pro-life group at Eastern Elite recalled, I remember freshman year, our posters would be like, life starts at conception and ends at Planned Parenthood, and we'd have blood spatters on the posters, or we'd have a fetus developing, and the fetus would be saying different things like, I want to be an airline pilot when I grow up. But these were like crazy. People hated them, like tore them down and defaced them. I learned from that experience. The student then goes on to say that his pro-life group started different kinds of campaigns for baby bottles, for pregnancy counseling, during which he worked across the aisle with the Women's Center at his university. In other words, his pro-life group, many of whose members had used tactics like this when they were in high school, didn't like the controversy they were stirring up on their campus and dumped it for the civilized discourse style that is appropriate for their campus. At Western, meanwhile, students generally stay away from civilized discourse because they think it can't attract the attention that they're looking for, and they say, frankly, it's not conservative enough and it's lame. So the twain of these two dominant styles pretty much do not meet on these campuses. Now, there's more to the story. These were the two that I've just described were the dominant styles, the dominant style at Eastern versus the dominant style at Western. We found two subordinate styles in our research used by conservative students. So by subordinate, I mean not used as often, and styles that would come in for critique when they were used. So on both campuses, a smaller set of students use a style that we call campaigning. This is very intuitive, hosting candidates, running phone banks, walking precincts, things of this sort. But while we might imagine that a lot of college Republicans would use these kinds of, this style on campus, it came under attack at both Western and Eastern. At Eastern, at Western, it caught a lot of grief because it was seen as an abomination because it kisses the ass of the national GOP. So the national GOP wants us to behave like good little college Republicans, but we think that's boring and we're not going to do it. So campaigning just doesn't get a whole lot of support there. It's not expressive enough, it's not fun enough, it's not what college students should be doing. At Eastern, meanwhile, there's a different kind of reason for why people don't want to be using campaigning. Some people do, but other people are just baffled as to why an intelligent, talented, prominent undergraduate would come to Eastern Elite and then work phone banks, for heaven's sakes. It just seems so practical and so plebeian. And the group at Eastern that really disparages this style the most engages in a what we call a fourth style of conservatism or conservative action, and we call this the highbrow provocation style. Now, highbrow provocation is different from the provocative style at Western. It's a kind of pedigreed National Review or Dartmouth Review style, consisting of ironic, sometimes philosophical, sometimes kind of vicious essays criticizing multiculturalism, political correctness, or the coddling of underrepresented minorities. Those are quotes. So these issues aren't so different from what the Western students are making fun of. It's just that the way they're being made fun of at Eastern is quite divergent. It's writerly, it's journalistic, it's literary, and quite frankly, it's elitist. So just to summarize, so you know where we're at, we've got the provocative style that is completely dominant at Western, the civilized discourse style, which is completely dominant at Eastern. Campaigning occurs in a little bit at both schools, and the highbrow provocation style is only available, really, at Eastern. Now, the next question is, should we be surprised at this variation in styles across these two universities, and what does it mean that there are these differences? Now, in several ways, the extent of these differences in styles is quite surprising. This is a really jammed up slide, but bear with me. For one, as we know, the demographic backgrounds of the students at the two schools aren't as divergent as one might have thought, so we might have supposed that their styles, the student styles, wouldn't be as divergent either. Second, we found that conservative students on these campuses are actually quite closely aligned in their ideological beliefs. Students at both Eastern elite and Western public agree about the need for small government, agree that we should have low taxes, agree that we should have a strong national security, and more or less even agree on the social issues. There's some divergence there, but abortion is contested at both of these universities. So it wouldn't be unreasonable to suspect that the styles they use, given the ideological similarity, would also be similar. And yet they're not. Another way that these campus differences in styles are surprising is that they seem to be somewhat disconnected from students' feelings of being in the political minority on their campuses. Interviewees at each of our campuses said that they were in the political minority, that this created some hardships for them, that they were constantly asked to justify their positions. They were constantly asked to, they felt like they were at odds with faculty and with their classmates. Yet despite this similarity in feeling kind of out of step with the rest of campus politically, the styles that the two groups used to talk about their feelings of marginalization were very different. Now, a fourth reason that our findings are surprising is that for the past couple of decades, at least, there's been a clear narrowing of conservative styles promoted by the Republican Party, what we might call polarizing or slash and burn tactics that look quite similar to what we're seeing at Western. So the fact that we're seeing these styles at Western but not at Eastern is actually quite interesting, even in the face of this homogeneity among the national party. So on the other hand, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised by these differences. The political right, like any other group, is varied. As David Brooks and so many others have noted recently, there's been a long-standing division between mainstream Republicans on the one hand and self-described movement conservatives or anti-establishment conservatives, for example, Newt Gingrich on the other. And this goes back several decades. Perhaps there are just more young Newt Gingriches going off to Western public type universities and more Olympia Snows going off to enroll at institutions like Eastern. There may be these selection effects among students already. But before we easily accept this argument that different kinds of political students are going to different kinds of universities, the Newts to Western, the Olympias to Eastern, we should look at what the campuses themselves do to shape these varied styles. That is, we need to look at how the institutional character of campuses play a role in crafting conservative actors. So what am I talking about here? When I say that the institutional character of campuses shape conservative actors, I mean both relatively intangible things about universities, like the cultural meanings of a university that are embedded in a school, that these make a difference in how students choose to express their politics. If people are at a party school versus at one of the nation's most prestigious schools, we think that these can shape conservatism while kids are in school, students are in school. In addition to this kind of cultural intangible stuff, I also mean that the actual daily experiences that students have as members of their specific campus can also create differences in their political styles. Students at Western Public and Eastern Elite have multiple interactions every day in their universities, whether these are extracurricular clubs, in the classroom, in housing facilities. All of these have an effect on how students feel on their campuses, and then, as we argue, how they decide to act politically once they're there. So in short, what I'm arguing is that local campus experiences matter a lot for the crafting of political identity and expression, or as we call it, styles of being a conservative. So let me show you what I mean by going back to the main differences in conservative styles between our two campuses, the provocative style at Western and the civilized discourse style at Eastern, in order to look more closely at how these cultural and organizational characteristics matter for shaping conservative students. And I think it's about at this point in the talk when people start thinking about their own institutions. So what's the institutional ethos here? What are the cultural, organizational experiences that students have that might push them into a particular style? So I hope that you will be thinking about that. So I'm first going to tell you about students' own explanations for why they do the things they do with their conservatism, and then I'm going to give you my analysis of those styles while still taking seriously what these students have said to me. So this is coming in two parts. So interviewees at Western gave us different reasons for being confrontational. Virtually all of them said that confronting liberals is essential for dealing with the sense of marginalization that they feel on their campus. They refer to faculty transgressions that alienate them, such as being singled out as the conservative girl in class. So for example, if we were having a lecture today and I said, Nate, as the conservative student in this class, can you tell us about the Republican Party's animosity toward healthcare reform? So being singled out like that, they describe as being a faculty transgression at times, fearing grade retaliation if they write something from a conservative perspective. They talk about their peers' behavior, not listening to them or not respecting their point of view. And they point to the overall liberal feel of the community where flagship is located. And all of this gives the confrontational style legitimacy in their eyes. They have to fight back. Interviewees also said that the provocative style is about having fun, a kind of playing gotcha with liberals. As one student says, angry liberals tend to be conservative activist bread and butter. I mean, college Republicans will do silly, stupid stuff, often very purposefully, to get people's emotions to come out. The idea here is that if they push liberals' buttons, and those liberals then fly off the handle and respond angrily, this is a great outcome as far as they're concerned. It just proves how fundamentally biased liberal faculty and peers are in the first place, and it's just very gratifying for conservative students to see liberal faculty's true stripes. Now, I don't know if you read about these kinds of things, but the University of Iowa College Republicans just last year had an affirmative action, they had a conservative coming out day. And a faculty member, may I use expletives in this room or should I not? As a sociologist, I like to say what people really say. So you can bleep this part if you need to. But a critical gender studies professor wrote to college Republicans, fuck you, college Republicans. And she then became absolute poster child, right? Exhibit A for how crazy liberal faculty are. They had played gotcha with her and they got her. So this is part of the fun for this style. Western students also mentioned that on campus like theirs, it was necessary to go big in order to get attention, not only from classmates, but also from the media, who love it when you stage these kinds of events, as well as potential political employers down the line. One of our interviewees said, if you can be perceived as somebody who brings a conservative message to evil, Western flagship, and all the socialists up there, you can have any job you want in the state. And this interviewee is being, he's exaggerating. He knows that the faculty aren't evil. He knows that they're not all socialist, but he uses this to excellent effect. And indeed, his own career proved that he was right, that this was helpful. So in quick summation, what we hear from students at Western is that they're isolated, derogated by peers and professors, and that in reaction they go big with their conservatism to show liberals we're here in order to have fun and to get political attention and jobs after they graduate. Now, putting on my analytical hat here, how can we explain how the university's institutional features, its culture and its organization, shape these students' understandings of the style that they should use? Now, the first thing that's important to note is that Western is a large state school where only about 25% of students live on campus, and only a handful have eating plans in campus dining halls. 75% of students commute from their off-campus apartments. And what we know from the literature on higher education is that these kinds of living patterns on university campuses for students who live off campus, they tend to cluster with people who are of like mind. And so this means that a lot of students who are of differing mind do not find places to live with one another on campus. So our argument is that this particular organizational form, off-campus housing, predominantly off-campus housing, contributes to the feelings of isolation of students on this campus. A kind of insularity and a weak set of community norms for respectful political discussions, and actual fewer social constraints on being kind of obnoxious. You know, if you're going to only live with people you know and who you share ideas with, if you go on to campus and play gotcha with liberals the next day, but then don't have to come home and live with liberals, you know, this may lower the bar for engaging in that kind of action. Second, students at Western also have much less personal contact with faculty than Eastern students do. As noted before, there's a much larger student-to-faculty ratio at Western Public than there is at Western, and students take their classes in mostly large, very large lecture formats. And not unimportantly, there's an impersonal lottery system for getting into courses in the first place. This is very typical at large universities like my own. You are assigned a number based on a variety of things, and you end up in classes, some of which you don't need, you don't get classes that you do need, and you may while away the years while waiting for classes that you need. So this depersonalized system, I would argue, has effects on all students at Western, not just conservatives, but what we found was that this experience for conservative students who are already inspired by national organizations to treat their professors with mistrust increases, this kind of impersonal lottery system increases students' level of suspicion about the university, and again, it lowers the bar to more aggressive confrontation. Finally, we find that the institutional ethos at Western, not just these organizational structures that I've been talking about, but also the philosophy of the school itself, the feeling of the school, plays a major role in how students understand themselves as students, even in terms of their politics. Western, as I said before, is a party school. If you look at US News and World Report, for example, you see recreation being emphasized. And we argue that the provocative style actually comports very well with this sense of Western as being a really fun place to go to school. This sense of we're typical college students, we're supposed to have fun, we don't want to play it safe while while we're here. There's a sense among Western conservatives that college represents a kind of liminal stage where they can get away with being crazy college kids in their political activities. They want to play it big, they want to set traps for liberals, which they think makes their conservative points better on their campus. So here the argument is that for both cultural reasons and for structural organizational reasons, provocation fits really well as a style of conservatism at Western. Okay, so what's the story at Eastern? Why is it important to conservative students there to remain civil and to think of themselves as civil and to appear respectful of peers and professors? Now, to answer this question, I'm going to refer to just one more quote because it's quite telling. An Eastern College Republican said the following, let's sit there. Nope. Okay, so you'll just have to listen. Whereas a lot of the Republican message on other campuses is structured around these big eye-grabbing, attention-getting things because you have 60,000 students on campus who are more interested in the fraternity party, at Eastern, the way you get to students is much different because people are willing to go to a discussion seminar with an eminent academic. You don't have to be out on the quad protesting in order to get people's attention. And what this student is saying is that he and his classmates are free not to pursue such basically populist means to an end. What's really interesting here is that the student I'm quoting, at the very moment that I was conducting my interview with him, he had taken a semester off during the fall 2008 presidential election to work for Karl Rove. So Karl Rove is no stranger to provocative style, right? But what he's saying is when he's on his campus, he can't use that same kind of provocative style as national politics can. And when I pushed this interviewee to discuss what creates this difference while he's at Eastern, one overarching rationale eclipsed all others, and that is we engage in discussion and respectful exchange at Eastern because this is Eastern. We are part of a special elite community made up of world-class faculty and highly talented, important classmates today and tomorrow, and we have the luxury and privilege of being reasonable people in their company. Also interesting, though, is that Eastern interviewees said that this was also felt to be an obligation. They're compelled to engage in appropriate interaction, compelled to not put on events that would make people on campus feel uncomfortable. Discomfort isn't good. Being at ease is good. Elites are supposed to exhibit an almost ineffable ease amongst one another, and they're learning how to be elites. And this is useful for thinking about the pro-life scenario that I described earlier, in which students learn that blood spatters are not suitable for the purposes of getting a pro-life argument across. It makes people uncomfortable, and therefore it's necessary as college students to let that style go and lean into other forms of conservative expression. So students are actively learning to be civil in their conservative style. Not all of them came to campus with that style in their repertoires. They're taking on something like a collective eminence as students at Eastern. In addition, Eastern students have a fixed eye on their future careers, but unlike at Western, these students are convinced that for the types of futures they'll be having, applying for Fulbrights, seeking clerkships, heading up an affirmative action bake sale isn't going to look so good on their CVs or their resumes. So clearly there's an institutional ethos manufactured at Eastern of being in a special academic community that shapes conservative student styles. We see this as being bolstered as well by the organizational features of the campus as well. First, the housing system at Eastern keeps students on campus all 4 years. The campus overall is much smaller than at Western, which means that students know each other at least minimally by face, if not by name. Students eat communally in dining halls all 4 years with one another. And the way that students describe it is that they live in an Eastern elite bubble, a very self-contained social scene, which, as we argue, modulates conservatives' interest in being provocative on campus. They don't want to go rogue. There's too much to lose by doing that with these very important people. Class size, registration procedures, and students' more personal relationships with faculty also contribute to the overall necessity of civility. Many classes are seminars, which means that students get to know their faculty, their professors quite well, and they're also selected through what's called a shopping period. So students can go to class after class after class and see which class they want to be in, and they're welcomed into those classes. There are no ceilings on the number of students that can be in a class. Combined with their own sense of being special talents themselves, these students think that their faculty members are also very talented, and they wouldn't deign to take anything out on conservative students. So they have respect for their faculty, and their faculty have respect for them. So as a consequence of all of these cultural meanings and organizational features contributing to them, Eastern conservatives feel that they're part of the university's deep and manufactured community. Such a sense of community rules out, for most conservatives, the activist provocative style, despite its being a style that is vigorously promoted in GOP politics and national conservative organizations that are targeting college students. So let me wrap it up. I want to emphasize again that students at Western and Eastern, from their self-reports, were more similar in their styles at the time that they entered college than they were at the time that we interviewed them after they had been through the college treatment. Many had watched a variety of programming on Fox TV. They had attended protests and so on when they were young. I also want to say that while Eastern students were more likely in the aggregate to have upper middle class backgrounds, which might translate to a taste for a more refined, civilized discourse style, interviewees at both schools came from families of varying socioeconomic status and cultural consumption patterns. So we're arguing against the position that we're simply seeing campus styles reflecting students' pre-college habits. And we're arguing for the idea that campuses create pathways to particular types of conservatism. Now, this is important in a couple of ways. For one, the project is helping us learn more about the lives of these students, how they think about themselves and how they conduct their activities. It also helps us understand more about how college campuses act as incubators for certain political styles and not others. Provocation at Western, civilized discourse at Eastern. Political styles are not just reflections of individual choices, but of shared culture in interaction on real campuses. Finally, it gives us more insight into conservative politics at large, where the provocative style certainly has gotten a lot of play and leverage in today's Republican Party apparatus. Ideology, not style, has long been the research focus of people studying conservatism and liberalism as well. But at least in today's world, where more insular and polarizing politics are the currency, it would be a mistake to ignore one of the sources, one of the origins of these styles, which are college campuses. So with that, I'll end, and thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to talking with more of you about this.
Mary, thank you. Yes, sir, and wait for the microphone because we need, right here.
Where do you think students with technical majors fit in this discussion? Because I never noticed this in college, and I'm a political person, but I never felt like this is even an issue for me.
So you mean as a student going through faculty's classes, professors? Uh-huh.
Even taking my liberal arts courses and stuff, I never was confronted with this at all. And that may be because of my age also when I was in college. But, but I'm more interested in your feelings about currently, do people in technical majors tend to have less time to even spend thinking about these things, so they tend to ignore them even no matter what, whether they're conservative or liberal by nature when they enter college?
Thank you. So most of the students in our sample were from the social sciences. Econ, political science were really big majors among conservative students, but we did have engineers. We did have a range of academic majors. And what students would say is that most of the fault for feeling alienated in class, or if a professor was saying something that was off topic or overly partisan, that these would tend to happen in social science classes and humanities classes. But there were, there are also stories of math professors just going off on the Iraq War or things of that sort. Yeah, so things that seem really unhelpful to learning math. And the stories that we heard were convincing enough. Some of the stories were about, I had a friend who went through this, and she wrote from a conservative perspective, and she got a C- on the paper, and she should have gotten a B+. And so some of it was kind of secondhand news, but some of the descriptions were quite compelling in terms of faculty, and here's what they say. A lot of these students, particularly at Eastern Elite, say, faculty aren't trying to indoctrinate us, but they just kind of assume that everybody is here. Anybody who's smart is liberal. So there's just this kind of blindness among faculty. That helps.
Kind of building off that, a few years ago in Missouri, there was a young woman who sued Missouri State because she felt like she failed a class because she provided the wrong answer. It led to legislation based on her name that didn't pass, but it was all about intellectual diversity, David Horowitz's idea of that. Right. Although it didn't pass, I saw in my syllabi the next semester a little paragraph about intellectual diversity and respecting all ideas. Has there been a push for that in some of these campuses by these conservative groups?
Thank you. So academic integrity is something that, and intellectual diversity is something that universities specifically say that they're for. And under that general heading comes students' rights as well. So in every university's and every state university's bylaws, this appears. So part of what David Horowitz and the Academic Bill of Rights is trying to do is just highlight this, but doing it at kind of the state legislature level. So he is bringing the topic up as if it had never been abided by before. So it's definitely a political gesture.
Yes, ma'am. Here comes the microphone.
What do you think are the differences between the ways that the conservative students are socialized into their roles on campus versus the more liberal or progressive students? What would be the differences, and what would make those students, feel communal and active?
Right, that is such a great question. We did not collect data with liberal students, so this is more speculation, and some of it is based on what I've heard from conservative students as well. So my feeling is that we would see, if we were to do research on liberal students at each of these universities, we would see that liberal students were more provocative at Western and more engaged in civilized discourse at Eastern. That said, I think that they wouldn't need to go to either extreme. At Eastern, they wouldn't need to practice with such a forethought about how they are going to be seen by the rest of the campus, because they assume that they already fit in. And for the conservative students at Eastern, a lot of this is demonstrating that we're normal too. One of the students said to me, one of the things that we're trying to do is not act like crazy wackos while we're in college, so that when our liberal classmates go out and start making big bucks and they have to start paying taxes and they feel bad about becoming more conservative, they won't look back on conservatism and say, you know, oh, they were wackos. I feel better about becoming more conservative. So I think that liberal students are not, you know, faced with this same sense of I have to go out of my way to appear really, really reasonable. And, you know, by the same kind of logic, students at Western don't have to be as provocative because the people that they would need to provoke are already on their side. But I think that these styles would tend to follow for liberal students.
Yes, got a question with a cap on right back here. The cap on.
How often on these campuses did you see conservative groups co-opt people of similar political beliefs, most notably libertarian students and students of that sort?
Great question. So I was collecting data in 2007. This is pre-Tea Party, and before libertarianism had really become much more talked about. At Western, this is a Western state, an interior West state, not California. There's a tradition of libertarianism on campus, or you know, in these states politically. And so these students were more kind of on the libertarian bus. Some of them were already. And it was really interesting because the libertarians had a really, really hard time getting folks to organize on campus. And you know, one libertarian joked, you know, trying to get libertarians organized is like herding cats because they all have these different kinds of, you know, issues and don't agree with one another, can be quite contentious and so forth. At this point in 2007, 2008, conservatives weren't thinking about, you know, the mainstream conservatives weren't thinking about how they would have to bring the libertarians in as much. Thank you.
Caroline?
You mentioned that most of the students describe themselves as either religious or spiritual. And did you delve into at all what brought them from one particular denomination or background into being more conservative?
So this is a tricky part of the book. So one of the things that we noticed was that at Eastern Elite, conservative students skewed Catholic, whereas at Western Public, conservative students skewed more spiritual but not religious. Some of them were kind of Protestant, you know, different parts of Protestantism. Some identified as evangelical, but not very many. So it was our couple things here. The students at Eastern were really interesting to me because I had done the interviews at Western first, so I was expecting to find evangelicals and Protestants and spiritual but not religious there. And what the conservative students there said was that I got to Eastern, I was a practicing Catholic, or I wasn't Catholic at all. And then when I started learning more philosophically about conservatism, less kind of partisan stuff, I wanted to go into a deeper mode of conservative philosophy. And they found that in Catholicism as opposed to other Christian religions. And then I think on the spiritual but not religious folks at Western, I saw that as kind of being compatible with libertarianism. There were some people who said that they weren't religious at all, that they were a little worried about saying that as conservative leaders. But those are the main differences in religion. Thanks.
Alex?
Thank you very much for your presentation today. Appreciated it. I was wondering if you could speak to, first off, if you know if this research has been done or if you see a value in it, of basically the research you've done except going the other direction, meaning college campuses that may skew a bit more conservative, maybe schools throughout the South, Christian colleges, and students who are more progressive and more liberal, and really the exact kinds of things that they might experience, where they might say, you know, hey, as a liberal person in the room, like, tell us why the Democrats think this. And my second part of that question is more nuanced, of even looking beyond the college campus. And the reason that came to my mind is I was talking to a friend of mine here in town the other day who has an 11-year-old son, and the son had come home from school that day, and she had asked, like, hey, how's school today? And she said, oh, we learned that Charles Darwin's an idiot. And she said, well, what do you mean? And she's like, well, our teacher was teaching us today, and every time she mentioned his name, she said he was an idiot. And so he's an idiot. And he was saying this with a straight face. And so the mom had to kind of backpedal and try to, you know, not suggest he's not an idiot, but just more to the point, suggest that we need to be careful about labeling people an idiot if we don't believe in their science or their point of view or their whatever. But for this kid in his classroom, that clearly was not the case, and that was not the climate of the room. And so the first question was more about the college campus and the inverse, universities throughout the South, large schools, small schools, or private Christian colleges throughout the country. And the second part would be just about other levels of education.
Mm-hmm. Well, so excited you asked those two questions. First, I'm looking for a graduate student to do research on precisely what you mentioned. I think that would be a fabulous dissertation into book, the obverse of what I was looking at. As you can tell, I'm a northerner. I have a total northern set of blinders on. I had thought in this comparative case study that it would be fantastic to have a southern Research One university. I thought it would be fantastic to have a private religious university, but there's only so much you can do. I stopped at 2. But I do think that it would be really, really interesting to see what happens for liberal and moderate students too. We don't know very much about moderate students and how they feel. In terms of your second question, let me refer you to my first book, which is called Contentious Curricula, Afrocentrism and Creationism in Public Schools. And it's a study of 7 cases across the country to challenges to K-12 public school curricula. And one of the cases was creationism, and I talked quite a bit about that case. But you know, these things go hand in hand too. K-12, higher education, bleed into one another.
Let's give Amy a round of applause here.